This is a forgery. For the real thing, come to the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago.
Well, he was a human as well. We talked about humans, and he was, and he came up as a white male in 19th century America, pre-Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
So one can see, and it is good to have this discussion because it gives a more nuanced view of him, and for that matter, to me, makes him greater than ever because he was able to overcome whatever that was in him.
Well, what I like to do, I use an exercise on him like this with my classes, and what I try to tell them is that the object is not to show that he was bad in certain ways. The object is to show that he was human. And if he's human, he might be able to be replicated sometime. If he is the great God, he may not come back.
Can I add to that? I think that's a really good point because related to this, my students, when I was at Kingwood High School teaching history, we read an essay on Martin Luther King Jr., and in the course of that essay, his marital infidelities were discussed. And my students were really upset by that, that was the case. But I had a young girl who said to the entire class at the time, she said, "This gives me hope because if he's a flawed figure and can still achieve these things, then this tells me that I can make a difference too." And I think that actually, a human Lincoln is a better Lincoln for everybody. And so much of sometimes it seems to me that the loathing stems from kind of this disappointment that we viewed him one way. And even Bennett said this, I was growing up in Mississippi, I thought he was the apostle of brotherhood, and then I read some of his statements in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and, there's this sense of, oh, he wasn't what I thought. And so I think we're all better off in the sense to address these arguments, and Bill's exactly right to broaden them.
Now, in the 1960s, we talked about the time of upheaval, and the left, the American left, went after Lincoln as well, and libertarianism has had now a big streak of that. I have a cousin, maybe Jerry Kay is watching right now, and emailing a loathing question for us. If you want. So libertarians have. Now, was there a libertarian movement of any sort in the Civil War, or was that later on for loathing Lincoln at least?
Well, I don't know that they consciously would have called themselves libertarians in the 1860s. That would be to impose a 20th century term on a 19th century era. But yes, we have a very, and it's one of the reasons the subtitle of my book is it's an American tradition, and this hostility to the federal government or this hostility to centralized government is very much a part of who we are. And so in that sense, I would say there has been a libertarian streak within our country's history, and certainly it's the libertarian critique of Lincoln is more prevalent now than maybe it was, at least as a conscious movement, than it was in the 19th century.
Could I add to that? One of the shockers to me in the research was finding out that this strand of, it's not libertarianism, we can't impose that, but this notion of state rights, of local control, was actually deeply embedded in many abolitionists as well. And it factored into their conciliation after the war. And to them, the people who we would expect to be rabid executioners, the ones who would want to go out there and hang rebels, they actually were forgiving and wanted to patch up the country, partly because they also believed in state rights and in local control, and the fact that you shouldn't have government just impose itself on everybody. That was a shocker to me. I did not expect to encounter that. So it's not just even a Democratic issue. It can actually inform some Republican thought in the 19th century as well.
I want to get back to a point you raised before I get to a point I really wanted to get to right here, and that is the provost marshals. You say how they were, of course, they're on the ground,
right?
And we're going to get to some of that on the ground as well. But on the ground, they were a tiered effect, you mentioned. And as you've been pointing out, much of it was towards speech and women. the Beast Butlers, was one of those. And,
Right.
and Burnside, certainly, with Vallandigham, another one.
Absolutely.
That took matters into maybe their own hands to some extent, yes?
Yes, oh, absolutely. I mean, Burnside, it's well recorded in the literature that he kind of embarrassed Lincoln with his orders. I think it was General Orders number 38, that essentially said that if you speak out against the government, I'm going to consider it, and he used the term implied treason, which is totally illegal. I mean, it doesn't fit any legal precept of our country. But he said it'll be considered implied treason, and you will be arrested. And of course, he did. I mean, Vallandigham was running for governor. He was deliberately provoking his own arrest, really. He wanted to try to make that law ridiculous. And he got more than he bargained for. Vallandigham was arrested. And then, as you know, he was first of all tried by a military commission and was to be executed, or at least imprisoned for life. But then, of course, Lincoln stepped in and they modified it, and all they did was banish him. And then he went to the Confederacy and then up to Canada.
They didn't want him either.
They didn't want him either. So what you have here, when you think about it, is a guy running for public office, a governor, who speaks out against the administration, which is perfectly fine political speech, who gets arrested, banished. His whole life is in turmoil. And none of that came because Lincoln was actually ordering it.
Well, here I have just an envelope with a free franking signature of Vallandigham. And when I got it, I also got these two little pieces of newspaper that talked about that. One of them says, "Another arbitrary arrest. Vallandigham arrested by soldiers at Dayton, Ohio. Indignation of the people in Dayton. Unsuccessful attempt at his rescue." And that's one says. The other one says attempted rescue by the Copperheads. So there were
By the
those.
way, that's a little overstated, but go ahead.
Well, that's exactly what they're saying here, and what they felt, I guess, on the ground.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was overstated the extent to which it was a rescue effort. Nobody really came.
So there's an interesting thing. Now, you were talking about also I'm going to show this other little piece too, which is kind of interesting. The Chicago Platform of '64, and we should maybe talk a bit about the election of '64 and that it actually came about. This is a little broadside that was a handout that was there as a poem for the Chicago Platform, where McClellan was involved with.
Right.
And it says in the first paragraph there, "Is there a slave who sues for peace while the rebel flag is flying? Who would his country's cause disgrace with thousands for it dying? The paltry knave who dare dictate such measures to a freeman deserves to meet the traitor's fate and hang as high as Haman."
That's right.
So you bring Haman into this book, and that they wanted to hang some of these people higher than Haman.
Higher than Haman, yeah. Who was the biblical figure for hanging back then. But the election of 1864 is interesting in this regard to me. And I feel like I'm doing a little bit of reclamation of the Democrats' reputation in this one. They have been portrayed as outright racists, totally. And that all they were white supremacists who could not condone emancipation, and that's what drove them in terms of their political beliefs. It's a little bit perhaps of an overstatement on my part, but it does capture at least the extent of the literature today. However, what I was surprised about was the extent to which arbitrary arrests were really on their minds, and how much that was at the forefront of the 1864 Democratic platform. And it's been kind of overlooked by historians today. That was their biggest critique against the Lincoln administration. It was the one and only one, frankly, that they could really succeed on. Because by the time they got to the national meeting, they had given up on emancipation as a battle to be fought. They understood that if they elected a person from a border state that still had slavery at that time, that they were toast. They were not going to go anywhere. So what they pushed hard during the 1864 election was freedom of the ballot and non-interference with the ballot by soldiers, and having the free election, which they kept proclaiming might not happen. And it is actually true that in this time period, I don't think we give enough adulation and respect to the very fact that the presidential election happened.
Right.
I mean, this is a pretty remarkable occurrence in that situation.
The Civil War Museum, a remarkable museum in Kenosha, a couple of hours from here, and all of you should go to that. Every one of you should get there some point. If you come to Chicago, take a train up to Kenosha and see this fabulous Civil War museum, mainly on the soldiers of the Middle West, but it has repercussions beyond. There's a letter I just up there last week, and I saw a letter there from a soldier who was decrying that he could not get back home to vote. He was stopped. The only ones, he said, who could go to vote were those who were supporting the administration, and he would not get leave to go home. How prevalent was that?
Oh, very. Seriously, the Lincoln administration, way after the war, an assistant secretary of war unabashedly proclaimed that we did everything possible to get Lincoln reelected. And what that meant was Lincoln writing Ulysses S. Grant during the Overland, or actually by that time he's in Petersburg, and asking him to divert 5,000 troops to go home and be able to vote. I should back up and say that at this point in American history, balloting was different. There was no secret ballot, for one, so you could actually see everybody's vote and how they were going to vote. So it was easy to
That was the electoral tickets.
The electoral tickets
that we see
right.
today.
They were color-coded ballots. You placed them in the right ballot box in front of everybody, so no secret ballot. But secondly, absentee balloting was not the norm. As you entered the Civil War, I think one state may have allowed people, especially soldiers, to vote by absentee ballot. By 1864, 19 states are now jumping on board, mostly because of Republican influence, because they all believed at that time that the people in the ranks who were most likely, how they were most likely going to vote was for the Republican Party, or for prosecuting the war, I should say. And so they were working hard to try to get absentee ballots. Nonetheless, if you don't have it, what do? You furlough troops. You send them home at just the right time so that they can be in their communities and vote at home. And the communiques are right there. I mean, Grant is written to by Lincoln and says divert troops. Sherman is asked to spare 5,000 to send back home to Indiana in order to influence the balloting then. Also, generals were sent home to make public political speeches, which is what we would not even consider
anyway.
today.
Right.
We would not allow our generals to go home and give political speech and say, don't vote for Obama, vote for
But they're still political
someone
people.
else.
Leslie Clark was sitting in this chair
Yeah.
years ago, and
Right.
I asked him about politics in the Army. He said, "Oh no, there's no politics in the Army." I let it go.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But nonetheless,
Yeah, right.
Doug in Richmond, thank you. Kentucky is
My hometown, by
yeah.
the way. Yeah.
Doug has
Hi,
asked
Doug.
a question of the two of you, I guess. How could Massachusetts accuse secessionists of treason when, before the Civil War, Massachusetts had threatened to secede more often than any other state, 6 times? For both of you.
So what the answer is, how do people not be contradictory?
I suppose.
I guess that's be dead, because anytime you're alive, you're a walking contradiction. They are, before the war, Massachusetts and other states are especially during the Hartford Convention way back when, during the War of 1812, are trying to first offer secession as an option, meaning to break away from the Union, because they were unhappy with the way the war was being prosecuted. They also, back then, were really interested in abolition. Massachusetts is one of the purest of abolition states, and they had some of the, as you know, crankiest of people in them. William Lloyd Garrison, who all he did was burn the Constitution in order to make his political points, which didn't win him many friends from outside of abolition ranks. So that was the nature of the beast before the Civil War, where they were suspicious of government. Government hadn't gotten them anywhere. Political parties hadn't gotten them anywhere. And so they were being, well, extremists. So then they come into the fold during the Civil War, and suddenly they're on board with government. And that's just the way the political situation flip-flopped.
I think a couple of things I would answer to that is that it's threatening secession is not quite the same thing as doing it. And secession was, to some degree, a rhetorical tactic prior to 1860. It wasn't necessarily a program. So I think that's one thing, although obviously contradictions abound. Also, too, to mention, go back to the Hartford Convention, when it got out that secession had been discussed, that really ruined the Federalist Party because they were seen as, at best, disloyal, maybe even treasonous. I'm no expert on that, but it wasn't looked upon very, very well.
And they did the one thing you never do, which is look like you're not supporting soldiers in the field.
Exactly. So, and I think too that, and again, I mean, I think it also, if you want to talk about secession, it also depends upon what you're seceding for. And that is something that I think always kind of gets tied up with the secession in 1860 and 61.